Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Crimes and Times. Tonight, we're going to have a very interesting conversation with two retired ATF agents. We're going to discuss a serial bombing investigation, how it works, what they've done, and how that fits into what happened down in Austin, and get their insight. As you notice, there are no pictures on the screen tonight. We're just using the ATF symbol. Based on the work they've done and the work they're doing now, we decided it's safest to keep their picture off the screen and just keep their identity private. As always, we ask you to please go on to YouTube and not only like us, but subscribe. Hit that little bell icon. We're very close to having our 100 subscribers. So if you do that, we can get ourselves out on other platforms. All right, moving on to the show. We have with us Paul and Frank, who are two ATF agents I had the pleasure of working with many years ago. Paul, we'll start with you. If you could just give us a little background of what you've done in ATF and maybe describe a bombing case that you've worked on. And then we're going to kind of figure that one into the Austin case.
Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Paul, and I worked with ATF from 1987 to 2016. All the ATF agents get training in firearms investigations and explosives training. So a lot of us are just generalists. There is additional training that the ATF agents follow up on. They become explosive specialists, which puts you in a specific area of investigations. Explosives pretty much generally is what you work. But in my experience here in it's out of Albuquerque.
That's fine. We'll get that out. They still don't know who you are, so we're okay. All right.
Yeah. The first case, I was a young agent. I was only on the job for less than a year, and on October 24th, 1988, a woman by the name Connie Weatherby, a single mother with a 1-year-old kid. She had been in the Army. She was a veteran. And she was living in an apartment in Grants, New Mexico. Her friend, Teresa Baca, went to pick up a package that was addressed to Connie Weatherby. And she went to the post office because they had left one of those yellow stickers that you have a package. So Teresa Baca was 31 years old, lived in the same apartment complex, who had cerebral palsy. She went for Connie and picked up the package. Connie got it, put it on the kitchen table. The 1-year-old was in another room. Connie opened the box, and then inside there was a kind of like a jewelry box. She pulls it out and opens it up, and it detonates. And it blows her top of her body off. Just leaves the bottom sitting in the chair. Her friend is injured, taken to the hospital here in Albuquerque, and a couple weeks later she succumbs to an infection sepsis which would killed her from the wounds she received from the explosion. So what we do is we got called, ATF did, and since it was a package that came through the mail, the U.S. Postal Service is involved in it. They have their inspectors, and they and us and the local PD, after the body was removed and Ms. Baca was transported to the hospital, we started a systematic search of the room, the kitchen area, and the living room area, picking up any pieces of fragments of the box, the jewelry box, what we thought was a jewelry box, but any evidence of the initiator or the detonator, what kind of explosives it might be. All this stuff is packaged and eventually sent to the lab for chemical or forensic analysis. Any pieces that big enough that might have had a fingerprint, because back then the DNA hadn't come to fruition at that point, so DNA wasn't on our radar to pick up items that might have DNA on it. So what happens is they found a postmark piece of the package, revealed the postmark. The postmark indicated the package came from the post office at Circus in Las Vegas, Nevada. So at this point, we don't have any suspects. The local PD doesn't have any suspects, and then we start, interviewing. We're assigned people to interview, friends, acquaintances, family members. 150 individuals were interviewed. What was astonishing about this case, an ATF pretty much became a secondary investigative body. The lab, the stuff went to our lab, I believe. But what the Postal Service did is they identified the postal clerk who was working during the time the package was received, and they put the woman, the postal clerk, under hypnosis.
Wow!
And she was able to give a description for the sketch artist to come up with a sketch of the guy who dropped the package off, which ended up having the explosive device. It's the first time, of course, I witnessed that, and the ATF agents also was something new. I don't know if ATF itself has a hypnotist that does that kind of stuff, but the Postal Service did, and it was interesting. So they came out with a sketch of the guy who dropped the box off, and
from that sketch, I'm sorry, go ahead.
From that sketch, some of the people that we, were interviewed, most of the men and the gals that did the investigation did a look at the sketch, and one guy that really resembled the sketch was a guy named Randy Frost, F-O-R-S-E. And it turns out in further investigation that he had been the boyfriend of Connie Weatherby. Basically, he wanted to get married to her. I believe that he was rebuffed from continuing the relationship, and so there was the focus became on him, on Randy Frost. The search warrant was executed at his home, where he lived with his parents. He was a 33-year-old man, and he lived at his parents' house in Grants. They found explosive material there, making material, reference books, stuff that probably now you get off the internet.
Right.
But it turns out in further investigation, he worked at at a mine up in Grants. That was, I think it was a uranium mine up there, if I'm not mistaken. And he worked as the supply clerk. And it was determined that he had access to explosives, detonators, and so forth and so on, and explosive material. And he was interviewed, and it was finally, determined. He made an admission. Of course, we had enough physical evidence
right.
to put him with the bomb. And it was later determined, of course, in talking to him, how did you get the bomb to Las Vegas? So in talking to him, what he described is he drove his new Camaro, because working at the mine, you make a lot of money, since Grants is a pretty poor area of New Mexico, and this was 1988. So he had bought a new car. He drove that car after constructing the device. He drove it to the airport, got on a Southwest Airlines flight to Las Vegas, and carried it on board the plane.
Which would be
back in
highly unlikely.
1988.
That'd be highly unlikely today that he'd get past that, right?
Correct, because of course, in between we had 9/11 and other incidents of bombs on planes. But at that point, they only, I believe, they only X-rayed and checked the luggage going underneath. So he flew to Vegas with the bomb, which he had constructed. It was a device. I don't know if I want to get into it, but
No,
it was
right. Let's not give him school on bomb making, right?
Right. So he had it addressed to her, and she was killed as a result of it, of his jealousy or his rage for being rebuffed as a boyfriend.
Paul, you bring up some really interesting points there because, so many facts there. One, today I was speaking with the media about the YouTube shooting. They're asking about female shooters versus male shooters, but the same issue comes up. I said, irrespective of the sex, so often the motivation for the shootings, these bombings, is being a sperm couple. That seems to be such a strong driver of this criminal and homicidal activity. And you also talked about the fact that we have a homicide is really what we have, and as the federal agencies, whether it's ATF, Postals, the FBI, we don't need to have jurisdiction over it just to come in and help, which ATF so often did when I was in the FBI, just helping with your expertise. So that's a big value that people say, well, what does the ATF do? They don't have to prosecute it, but man, you guys have some great expertise, as do the postal inspectors, and that's why it's so important that we work together these days, because everyone brings in something new. Let's go over to Frank. Frank, tell us a little bit about what you've done and maybe a case that you remember in terms of a bombing.
Yes, although I was stationed in a particular office with ATF, I was very privileged to have been contacted by an individual that had just left the federal pen, and he was very interested in not getting in trouble with the ATF in the future for firearms crimes. And basically treated him with respect, was very kind to him on the phone. He was obviously a former veteran with extensive special forces training. And I guess he was very impressed by how nice I treated him. And so 6 months after that call, 6 years after that call, he then recontacted me back and said that one of his pod inmates in the federal pen had sent him an email, basically in so many scripted words, asking for blasting caps. And based on what he knew of this individual in the pod, the guy was an individual that was gathering lots of information on explosives, on all sorts of explosive chemicals and this sort of thing. And he was concerned that this individual who lived in a foreign country might be very interested in attacking the United States. So from there, I met with him, obviously turning him into a police agent, an informant, and immediately came up with a cover story. And what it was, our particular individual had been in Vietnam. And so what we did is we went ahead and contacted the EOD on the air base, the local air base.
And just for the audience, Frank, EOD is?
Explosives Ordnance Division or group from the Explosives Ordnance of the U.S. Air Force, and they had explosives that we could use in a staged photograph. So in those days we used Polaroid. This is in 1998, and I went ahead and did the old-fashioned thing of photographing all these explosives basically in an old shed, and basically we had M60 fuse igniters, M18 Claymore mine, an M2A4 bounding anti-personnel mine, inert M65 impact fragmentation grenades. We had 35 pounds of military TNT, 24 pounds of military demolition C4, military electric blasting caps, military non-electric blasting caps, 1,000 feet of military det cord, 200 feet of military time fuse, and we had some other items in there, and basically put numbers for each of these things, 1 through 13 or whatever, and mailed off the photograph to Canada. And within a very short time, we got an immediate response on the email at that time you couldn't remote into somebody's email. So basically I wrote ghost emails for 18 months, working, acting as the informant, replying to this individual, trying to figure out what he was up to. But the immediate response was, this is wonderful fishing equipment. He talked in terms of fishing.
Right.
He said, this is great fishing equipment. I have a lot of hooks and holes that they could go into. However, I have developed my own stuff. It works much better than any of your military stuff. All of that stuff is wonderful to have. I have better stuff that I've developed, and if you want to know more about it, come up and see me. So right from there, he said, I'm worried about being monitored. So we went to immediately to encrypted email. And of course, we had each other's decoding and coding of the messages. And for 18 months, we went back and forth. Eventually, we were able to get the informant into Canada, meet with him. And on the very first day that we met him in 1999, he was one of two Millennium bombers. And this individual's plan, once we got up there, the very first day, he says, I'd like to bring over the explosives right to the hotel so that you can test them to make sure that they work. I believe they do. He had hinted that he had tested them, but we didn't know exactly where that was at. So he brought over 2 large packages. He brought over, I think it was 1.5 pounds of pentoerythritol tetranitrite, PETN, and also what he thought was,
right. We hear that a lot about lately.
Yeah, PETN. Mm-hmm. And PETN, detonates at about nearly 5 miles a second. It's a very strong explosive used in all military bombs. And he brought 1.5 pounds of that, and then and he also brought what he believed to be 7 pounds of RDX. It was a lower grade. Cyclonite, it's called, and it's a lower grade explosive. But anyway, he brought that over to the hotel. We didn't want to have any of the people in the hotel in British Columbia, injured by these explosives. So we had the police agent or the informant to head out immediately to the parking lot, meet him out there, and take possession of the explosives out in the parking lot, which we did, and tested them. And of course, the PETN was in good shape. It worked very, very well. And so we knew the individual was serious. We commenced on a long-term undercover investigation. Eventually, we met him in 1999, right before the millennium. He delivered 14 large bombs to destroy the Trans-Alaska Pipeline energy system. It was set to go off at the millennium. And he figured, although he was getting revenge against the United States, he also wanted to make some money in this particular plot. So he invested in the oil futures and gas futures. And in one particular statement, we have the informant on tape ask him, obviously people can get killed. I mean, one of the places that he's targeting with these bombs was the security station for the pipeline at a particular pump station at that time. And he says, people can get killed. And he basically shrugged his shoulders and said, well, there's no death penalty in Canada. So I'm not concerned.
You said he wanted revenge on the U.S. Specifically for what?
He had been jailed by the United States. He was a sort of a con man. He had come into California several years before. The reason he was jailed with our informant is that he would do surveillance on large houses in Malibu, and when you went off on vacation, he would post a for sale sign and sell the house.
I know those
and then
frauds.
walk away with the money.
Yeah, I've seen those frauds.
Yeah, so,
but it's funny. Once a con man, always a con man. Here he is trying to pull off
exactly
what we call a terrorist attack, but he's really trying to make money on it.
Exactly. So might as well make money. So of course, once we hit the house and found he had made 50 or more additional bombs for not just the pipeline, but for energy systems all over and oil pipelines across Canada. So he definitely had a long-term, long-range plan and was very good at what he did. He was an engineer, certainly.
Right. So, guys, what I see in both cases, and we all know this from common knowledge, making bombs is not something that can easily be done, even though we know from years and years ago, you can get on the internet, but still pulling it off requires a certain skill set. And
yes.
Does that fact help in the investigation, knowing that someone has to have got some training somewhere or had an accident somewhere or must know somebody? Is that kind of a starting point for an investigation, either one of you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this particular guy was very careful, although we had one email that came through, an encrypted email, saying that the night before last he was making a batch of PETN, that it went red hot on him, and he almost took out his neighborhood as he was stirring the vat, and it was at that point that the RCMP that I was working with, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, were very concerned that we needed to go ahead and take this case down because, obviously we were putting in danger the community there. Unfortunately, at that time, and in 1999, 1998, the Canadians had no terrorism laws, and basically it was always thought that we'd extradite him to the United States, which we eventually did 7 years later. He fought extradition for 7 years. But what it was is that he basically, he could have been charged with only illegal possession of explosives as a 6-month misdemeanor at that time.
Right. Yeah, those things. Now, Frank, if obviously this guy had terrorist and financial concerns, had you guys not stopped him, had he been successful, he would have gone on with more bombings, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, he had plans for long-range
Right.
bombings, utilizing all sorts of detonating techniques.
Exactly. Now, Paul, your guy, let's say he had gotten away with this, you guys didn't capture him. Do you think he would have continued to bomb, either because the thrill of having done it successfully, or do you think, his next bad relationship, he would have thought, well, it worked once, it worked again? What do you think? Would he have become a serial bomber had he gotten away with it?
He might have, but I think he's just so infatuated with this woman that he didn't want her to be spurned, and she apparently she was very receptive to getting the money and taken out to places and so forth. So I don't know if he would have done it again. He was not very. He did have a associate's degree, but it wasn't in anything involving explosives research or anything like that. But I don't know. It's hard to say. Maybe if he got away with it, he would have gone on to other things. But
right. Just speculation. We just don't know.
Based on the Postal Service's work, ATF's work, he was arrested a week or so after the event, so it didn't linger on too long,
Right.
And it was helpful for the lady to get hypnotized and come up with that sketch, because it all fell in place. He pled guilty to 35 years in the state court. I don't know why the feds didn't want to prosecute, because he had numerous federal violations there, but he took a plea of 35 years for killing those two people. And in New Mexico at that time, it was he'd get half off a good time.
Well, it's interesting you say that the feds didn't want to prosecute, because as you were speaking, I'm thinking two things. One, I like to pride myself on saying in my 27 years in law enforcement, I've seen every investigative technique, but now I have to admit I've never been involved in a hypnosis case where we've done that. But I also remember learning that, at least in the FBI, we were really hesitant to work with the hypnosis. And I don't know if they ever did. I'm sure there might have been a case that I wasn't involved in. But the concern was that someone could argue of sort of a hypnotic suggestion, putting an idea into someone's head, and it made them at that point an unreliable witness. Maybe the feds were considering that when they didn't want to prosecute. Well, we just don't know.
I don't know.
But Frank, let me go to you now, Frank. Let's talk about Paul's case, Frank. Let me ask you about Paul's case. Here he had a lot of evidence. You talked about, and when people talk about bombings, we always say, wow, the destructive nature of it. But within that destructive nature, isn't it true that it leaves behind a lot of forensic evidence that we could follow, especially more so now than years ago? So as it's destructive as it is, it actually leads us quite a path of clues, doesn't it?
It does. You're going to have wires, you're going to have nails, you're going to have any of the constructive materials that he put it together with will be eventually found through careful evidence collection techniques.
So Paul, do you think if you didn't have that sketch, do you think that forensic evidence might have led you to this guy, looking back at it now?
Well, yeah, determining the specific explosive he used was pretty much restricted to the mine use, so maybe it would have led back to the mine out there, and who has access to explosives? Well, the supply guy does, and you were the boyfriend at one time, so maybe that would have led us back to him if it was determined from forensically that explosive material matched what they were using and at the mine. Yeah, for sure.
Right, because again, they do leave behind a lot of, like, the fingerprint of the bomb. Isn't that significant, guys? Sort of how the bomb is made, what type of a trigger it uses, detonating device, what kind of material. Do bombers tend to use sort of one formula that seems to work? Is that a pattern you've seen in your investigations? Either one of you?
I'll answer. I can answer too, but in this particular case, he took the time to hollow out and make this jewelry box type of thing, and it just probably knowing that the girl would open up a jewelry box and thinking she was getting some jewelry, and
reasonable, right? Who wouldn't, right?
And but he took the time to carve it out, and then place the explosive material at the I'm sure your audience knows that most of this explosive material has to be hypercharged or detonated with a blasting cap of some sort, and so he had that all set up, and knowing he was going to take a plane ride, I'm wondering how. I guess he just took a chance that the pressure or something like that wouldn't have set off the device itself. I don't know. He just took a lot of chances with people's lives on taking it on that plane that day.
I would imagine. Frank, in your experience, do you think bombers tend to use sort of one fingerprint, one way of doing things as a matter of safety or comfort level?
Well, in my particular case, my Millennium Bomber, who lived in New Westminster, British Columbia, Canada, lived probably not more than a couple of miles away from Rassam, who was the other Millennium Bomber. And we thought they may have been related because they were using similar type technology for bomb triggers. They were using Casio watches and other types of safety switches, the silicon-controlled rectifiers, the SCRs. And these particular things were used also by both of the bombers in a very similar type construction. We then realized that perhaps there was an online Al-Qaeda type instruction booklet that may have led both of them to the same type of design at around the very same time, because they were in Canada at the same time making these bombs. So we thought they were similar. Of course, Rassam was being investigated by the FBI. This was the guy that was on the way to the LAX airport to commit that bombing, and when he was caught by U.S. Customs, and of course the FBI took that case over. And when we sent our evidence over to your lab, they said no, it's definitely just slightly different type technique of construction. So we linked them both to Al Qaeda, but not to each other.
That was one heads-up custom agent. I remember that. She did a really good job, didn't she, of sort of profiling him and pulling him over and stopping that bombing. Remember that?
Yeah, tackling him basically on the ferry. Yeah.
Yeah, good job. It was a female, wasn't it? Female customs agent.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, really heads up work. Terrific work. So we tend to think. I'm sorry, guys. I'm getting a little static there. I don't know if you hear that as well.
Yes, we can hear that, sir.
Yeah. Okay.
There it goes.
Oh, there it goes. All right. So we talk about the fingerprint. We talk about the evidence, because even if you look back at 1993, the World Trade Center bombing, we had that resolved pretty quickly. We had the Oklahoma City bombing bomber identified pretty quickly also. I was in headquarters at the time. I remember hearing the name long before it was out there. And that's a matter of all that. Wow, I'm getting really bad static there.
Yes, I can hear it.
Yeah. That's really
there it goes.
Yeah, nobody move. All right, it's probably where you're standing. That's again, it's probably of all the evidence that's left behind, all the shrapnel. And if you think about the lack of, I don't want to say lack of, but how much less technology we had now compared to what we have. I mean, then as compared to what we have now, I imagine ATF and all these bomb experts are 10 times better equipped to solve these bombings than they were years ago. Is that correct?
I know. I went on some training. ATF put on. They were doing training on car bombs, and so they used some property down there at the White Sands. And so each week that we were out there, they'd blow up a different vehicle and put different amount of explosives in there, and then we would chart where we found the rear view mirror. You know, if the bomb was placed in the passenger area. So everything was documented to come up with some sort of guide. You know, if you got this much explosives, this part, and it's placed there, this part will be blown out this far. You know, and so yeah, that was in the 90s also. So the ATF and I'm sure the FBI did a lot more training and research on explosive scenes and you know where certain parts, certain metals would be thrown off by the explosion. Like you mentioned, the World Trade in 1993, that was determined again by the rental vehicle was found to be rented from New Jersey because they had the VIN number on the axle that was found, the blown up truck. The same thing with the one at the Murrow building in Oklahoma City. They were able to trace it back to the rental company and eventually to who rented it. You know, so we have more digital ways to tracking vehicles now, right? So when it comes to car bombs or vehicle bombs, any rental, I'm not sure, but I'm sure they might be thinking about putting digital tracking devices on them. Especially, well, you're from New York, Mike. I'm from New York also. They had that guy rent a truck from a Home Depot in New Jersey and then killed those 8 people in New York City on a bicycle path. So, you know,
right.
So the parts on the vehicle help identify, you know, where it was manufactured, and possibly where it was purchased from or rented from. So yeah, technology's helped out quite a bit.
And, you know,
Mike, if I'm,
go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, if I might add, I know nowadays after 9/11 and now that we all work together under the Unified Command System, the ICS system, you know, and a lot of these bombs now are being reverse engineered. Not only the type of explosives that are found in the war zones across the world, but also homegrown terrorists. A lot of that stuff is actually looked at more carefully and reverse engineered by bomb techs from all our agencies, contributing to the single team concept of helping each other, you know, get to the prize. So exactly. I think that's what's helped a lot, the cooperation that we all have now.
And I know the FBI, and I don't know their whole history, you know, in terms of bombs, but I know we started developing the bomb capability once we were in Iraq and Afghanistan, analyzing the IEDs. And we're using that for military intelligence purposes. Again, looking at the fingerprint, looking at, you know, the construction. And when I say fingerprints to the audience, I'm not talking about literal fingerprints. I just mean the model and design, you know, of the bomb and trying to tie it to one certain group or another. And a lot of military intelligence came out of that. And ATF worked very closely on that. You know, just Paul mentioned from New York. But, Paul, that's how you and I met, I recall. We were at a meeting in Albuquerque on something. I forget the case. And you came up to me. And you said, hey, you talk like the guys from home. Where you from, right?
No, yeah. You were at a meeting at our office, and I said, who is that guy, man?
Right,
He
exactly.
must be from 33rd Street.
That's exactly right. Hey, whatever bonds us together, whatever Dick made it work, and had a great time working with you guys. So, you guys, did you follow the Austin bombing there?
Yes, I did.
All right, so what do you feel? What do you think of it? I mean, so we've seen motivation. Look, we look at Ted Kaczynski. We look at Rudolph, you know, the bomber. We look at Frank's guy. You know, we see sort of that terrorist mindset, whether it's actually to accomplish something, you know, that they think they're going to accomplish, or just angry at the United States. We see that. In Paul's case, we saw the spurned lover. We see that often in other types of violent events, whether shootings or bombings. What was, either one of you guys, what was the motivation of this Austin bomb? Did we figure that out? I haven't heard it. Have we heard that, or do you guys have any kind of suspicion as to what it might have been?
So based on his statement, Mike, he talked about him being a psycho or something to this effect, or that he was a madman of some sort. was just, someone who wanted to wreak havoc. And there's no better way than to, cause people to be on edge than to send out bombs on a periodic basis and setting up tripwires, mailing them, coming in from all directions, just causing that havoc that a madman might cause. In a sense, could also be a cry for help. Wanting to actually be caught at some point, which he was.
Right, and do you think?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. A couple things. So he supposedly, from what I recall, he used two different types of triggering devices. And that's why I was asking you guys before about, if their comfort level, the bombers tend to have one specific way. Did you find that either one, you find that unusual, that these two different triggering devices?
Yes, it is unusual because normally a bomb maker, once he's successful, will use a particular signature, or you call it a fingerprint, but a signature of a bomb would be a particular constructive technique that he uses, the way he solders his wires, the way he puts together his fuses, his fusing, and the bomb triggers, and that's how he normally feels comfort with. So this was kind of unusual that he was using different techniques, perhaps to throw off the forensic work that was being done.
Right. And so what kind of training did that require?
On the internet.
Yeah.
You think that
exactly.
really, that kind of, learning all that stuff and not having a mishap from the internet?
Oh, yeah. Well, look at what's going on, coming over from the countries that are breeding some of the Islamic terrorists. I'm sure they get some of that stuff through the internet. How to do that. I didn't know about pressure cooker bombs until the thing that happened up in Boston.
Boston Marathon. I was just thinking about. Oh, excuse me. I was just thinking about the Boston Marathon bombing, because I remember, we suspected that when the old Tsarnaev took his trip overseas. When that might have been when he got training, but he had what was it, 2 bombs or 3 bombs in succession at the Boston Marathon bombing. That took a certain amount of skill set, did it not, or did he just get lucky? And I don't mean lucky in a good way, obviously. I mean no disrespect to the victims there, but how do you pull that off without having gotten some sort of training?
Yeah, I'm sure he had the training, because I myself, I've never seen how that, what the mechanics are putting one of those together.
Yeah, he was using highly volatile material, Mike. Anytime you're using aluminum powder, I mean, that stuff's so sensitive to shock and heat and friction that just the act of screwing on the top of that thing, had it not been full of Vaseline and that sort of thing, or petroleum jelly, to lubricant of some sort, to not have that initiator. But in my particular case, we found that he had, in fact, been testing smaller devices, very small devices that would not attract too much attention in remote areas. We were able to actually piece together very small pipe bombs that he was using with PETN, and that he, in fact, had done test runs, and eventually we found that evidence while he was in custody, pending trial in the U.S.
Interesting. Now, guys, when you go into a scene of a bombing, let's say it was something such as Paul's case, or a domestic matter, or even something like the Boston Marathon, you go in there, you have to help people, you got to protect people. How concerned, let's start going back to the 80s or early 90s, before Boston Marathon. How concerned were you then with a second explosive device when you went in there? Did you guys first scan it somehow before you went in and did your crime scene? Or was it just not something you thought about back then? Either one of you guys.
It wasn't something I thought about.
It was not.
Yeah, in my case, Mike, I was working with the RCMP, and their bomb techs were very careful. And sure enough, as we came to find out later, stuff that we found was unlabeled ended up being high explosive perchlorate type high explosives that we hadn't identified till right before trial, that we thought was basically just a syringe bottle filled with something, and it actually had nitroglycerin in it. So these were things that, although they weren't packaged the usual way, and with no printing on them at all, and so we actually missed some of the explosives until the very end.
Interesting. So Paul, you just said that you wouldn't have thought of it then. If you worked that exact same case now, or let's say in the last few years of your career, a while back, how would you have approached that scene? What would you have done differently?
Yeah. Well, bomb squads usually are the guys that go there with a suit. Everything's cleared out, and people are moved away from the scene, and there's a search done for any other devices. After the the initial one went off. The secondary bombs are now routinely looked for prior to doing the scene.
Now, what if someone's injured in there, profusely bleeding, you got to bring in a medic? How would you handle it? Would you sort of try to clear just an area just for that purpose and hold steady until you could extricate the victim?
Yeah, that would be a priority, to getting triage to that person or getting them out. A quick check of a direct route to the victim would be laid out by the bomb guys.
Right. And, that's a new methodology last few years on active shooters. Rather than waiting to clear an entire building or an entire scene, to create what we call these warm zones. So say, all right, this area is at least clear for now. We could secure it from any threat, but let's get medics, first responders in there to treat the wounded, because there's that bleeding that kills if we don't control that bleeding right away. And obviously on these kind of gunshots or explosive, that's the most damaging, is when they penetrate the body and we have all that bleeding come out. So controlling the bleeding. So again, we've had to adapt. But what I found interesting, we're talking about technology, but Paul, in your case, had that happened now, just like in Austin, we wouldn't have had to hypnotize anybody. There would have been a tape of it, right?
Well, what do you mean, going into the post office?
Yeah, it would have been on tape probably, right?
Well, if it happened now, he wouldn't have been able to transport that bomb. They would have caught him right there,
right?
Right there at the gate. So he would have been, they would have cleared out the airport. And
exactly, it changes a lot.
Detonated,
Guys, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Detonated it there with the bomb squad if it would have happened now. So now he might have drove out there. Who knows, to avoid that. But
how dangerous would that have been? Bumps, an accident, would that kind of shock have possibly set off the bomb?
Sure. Well, whatever the actuator that has ignited the blasting cap. I don't know how secure he had that. The top down, because it was initiated when the woman opened it up, so it completed the circuit when it was open. So yeah, he took a chance. He'd take a chance either way. He traveled out there, by planes, trains, and automobiles. There would have been a chance of something happening. Yeah,
and
blowing himself up.
Yeah, I'm sorry. The bombs used today. I know we had this concern when I was a cop. One time we thought we had a bomb in a precinct where I was working out of. Are they still susceptible to detonation to radio, the electronic radio waves? Is that still a danger for most of these detonation devices?
Frank?
Yeah, it certainly can be, depending, again, what the bomb signature is, depending on the electronic component that he's using. Again, a lot of these smarter bombers, like in my case, using the electronic silicon-controlled rectifiers, those little, for lack of a better term, they're switches. And until there's a pulse of energy that goes through it, it doesn't open the switch to connect that circuit. And so modern bombers are getting more attuned to that sort of safety technique and utilizing that within their bomb. But if they don't use that and they use other things that could be messed with by radio waves, sure, absolutely could set it off.
What about cell phones? Are they used as triggering devices, remote triggering devices?
Absolutely.
They are. You're seeing that more and more from what you guys hear about?
Yeah, Al Qaeda has moved from the Casio watch to the cell phone.
Mm-hmm. And that must make it much more difficult to trace and obviously to detect, right?
Well, actually, it depends on what if the cell phone survives, but it can be. Usually, they're going to have a burner phone,
right,
that has no information in it, and it's just going to be used a one-time use.
Right, interesting. So, guys, my last question to you, going back to the Austin case, when the police came in on him, he blew himself up. Do you think he went out that night with the intention to commit suicide? Do you think that was another bomb? Do you think he planned to go out that way, or do you think it was just more of a panic because he didn't expect to get caught? And it's just supposition, I know that, but based on your expertise, what do you guys think?
I think he wanted to go out with a big bang. He didn't want to probably go through a whole bunch of trial stuff, and he didn't want to have to answer for the death that he caused.
Yeah.
pretty much a coward when it came down to that. But luckily, none of the law enforcement guys were hurt or injured as a result of it. I know one police officer was thrown back, or he might have been an FBI guy. I don't know. But yeah, so I forget the term they use. He self-annihilated himself, or but yeah, I have no idea what caused him to do that. I'm sure he was aware they were getting close to him.
Yeah.
There was
Frank,
enough.
Yeah. Frank, your thoughts?
Yeah, my thought was that he was on his way to another bombing to go set up this bomb or set it up perhaps with a tripwire, that sort of thing. And he was on his way. And once he realized the gig was up, he probably had a choice whether to go ahead and just take himself out. It's unclear. I know they fired their weapons into the vehicle, but it may have been right at the same time as the bomb went off. So, not being there forensically, I don't know whether. Obviously, the bullet could have set it off, but it sounds like he knew exactly what he was doing and decided to take himself out.
Right. Interesting. We look back at Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, and I remember, again, this is going back many years. We didn't have the technology we have now. If you guys remember how kind of he was caught, we being the FBI printed his manifesto. They wanted to print.
Yeah.
Remember that? And his brother,
yes,
identified him, and that really broke the case. But we didn't have any kind of idea. Now, when we talk about mass shooters, these days we always talk, what's a profile? And I know I do a lot with the media, and I say, I could probably give you the profile of the next mass shooter because they seem to have a similar profile. Certain age, things going on in their life, and we talk about the red flags. Changes in behavior that usually not for the better. So a sudden fascination with weapons that they didn't have before. I'm not talking about a gun enthusiast. Following the news of another, mass shooting, personal life deteriorating, whether it's a relationship, job, finances, and all these things kind of create a red flag, or the forms of mental illness. Even now with a YouTube shooter, we're seeing, again, this obsession with YouTube. Obviously so unhealthy that the family, even sensed she might be heading there. Leading to my question to you guys: if we heard of a serial bomber like Austin, can we build a profile as we do with the mass shooter to track him? And is there some sort of red flags we could tell people to look for to think they're heading in that direction? Obviously, it's less prevalent than the mass shooter, but nevertheless, it exists. And I imagine the more we see it on television, the likely chance we have copycats. So sort of a compound question there. Is there sort of a profile we could look for? And is there something that people could look for in terms of the warning signs? Paul, we'll start with you, then we'll go to Frank. I gave you the hard one.
Yeah. Profiles, it's like what's come out. If you see something, say something. Unfortunately, sometimes the ball is dropped on that with the law enforcement.
No, that's true.
This Austin guy, somebody had to know he was making those. I don't know if it's come out yet where he was making them, in the basement of the house there in Austin or out in the woods. He had two roommates. I haven't heard much whether they've been incriminated in any of this, but hell, they must have known he was doing something. Where was he getting the money to buy some of the components? Sending them out through the the mail. He must have been getting some money somewhere. So somebody knew that he was, spending his time on some things that maybe they should have questioned, his family or these friends of his, But I don't know if, Ted Kaczynski was he was a PhD. He was a smart dude, and look what happened to him. He ends up in a 10-by-10 cabin in the forest in Montana, I think it was, or somewhere like that, Idaho. But he was just off. He was just too smart. What they say, he was a genius, but a little bit insane. And Rudolph, I guess he was an extreme guy who didn't want to. He didn't believe in abortion, and he was, he just took his goal of ending abortion a little bit to the extreme by killing, the police officer and a nurse at one of the abortion clinics. Yeah, so extremism in both ways, left and right is not very healthy. And what motivates these people to do it, like Frank says, maybe he was reaching out for somebody to help him. The same thing with the shooter in Florida. There was a lot of signals on this guy, and maybe some of his student friends or students were, relentless in bullying him. The big thing about bullying, but gosh, the way they talked about him, he was very ostracized by the kids there at the school. That to me probably led to a lot of his anger, and wanting to get revenge on the school. But no one seemed to want to do anything with him in the sense of getting him some help.
Right, Frank, your thoughts about that profiling and looking for the red flags?
I think of lone wolves, and I think the lone wolf person is going to be an individual that's going to, truly isolate himself. He's a really professional bomber, like in the case of my individual, pretty much isolate himself from his family, isolate himself from all his business contacts, and goes to that hole somewhere, where he feels safe and can construct these things. And those individuals are very tough to penetrate. They probably have, I'm sure they have some sort of a loner type profile. At some point they do withdraw from all their social contacts, and I think perhaps that's going to be the biggest sign. Obviously, it's always the cooperation of good citizens that say things, come forward and say, he's been acting strange lately. I'm concerned about him. He's been reading certain books. He's been looking at the internet on explosives, this sort of thing, and that may be the clue that you need to get started on one of these cases.
Yeah, so it's interesting what you guys just said. We kind of came up with a little bit of a profile there. We probably see in bombers and the shooters, we see this withdrawal, this loner, for whatever reason.
Yeah.
We see they're bent on revenge, whether it's for a workplace or a lover, and then that's all of a sudden taken to the extremes. Now, we all want to get revenge on people. We're all mad at people, but when it becomes this obsessive thing, I have to get even, and you put in combination with these other factors, maybe we're seeing the warning sign there. Would we agree on that?
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Yeah. Right. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Paul. Go ahead.
No, I agree with you, Mike.
Well, guys, listen, you've given us a lot of information, a lot of inside knowledge there. We appreciate it very much, and just personally, it's just great to connect with two old friends, guys. So please stay in touch, and I'll talk to you guys soon. Thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.
Yes, good luck on
good luck on your political career, Mike.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Paul. Just for the audience's sake, Paul's referring to my current candidacy to be the Kansas governor, which I don't talk much about on the show because I try to keep the show just about crimes and times. Thank you, guys. Great talking to you. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Mike. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, Mike.
Bye, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. I think you got some great inside information on bombings and sort of the profile and what these ATF agents are up against. And you heard a little bit about the changing technology, how it could both help and hurt investigations. Once again, please go to Facebook and like us. Please share our posts and our videos with your friends, and hit that little icon and give us become a follower on YouTube. So thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Michael Tabman for Crimes and Times. Good night.